There's a small town that people often pass by on their way to the bigger cities, a quiet, unassuming place surrounded by thick woods. It was the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and secrets don't stay hidden for long. But one secret was buried so deep that even the locals preferred to forget it existed. They called it the Crawling Man. No one knew where the story began, only that it was older than anyone could remember. Parents told their children that if they didn't behave, the Crawling Man would come for them. Some said he was a vengeful spirit, others a cursed soul, but everyone knew the warning. If you hear scratching on the windows, don't look. Keep your eyes closed, stay still, and he might pass you by. Last Halloween, a group of teenagers, bored and eager to test the old legend, decided to spend the night in the woods. They were the usual mix of thrill seekers and skeptics, and all were eager for a good scare. They laughed off the Crawling Man as nothing more than an old tale to frighten children. They planned a night around a campfire, armed with ghost stories, flashlights, and a few bottles of stolen liquor. As the moon climbed high and the cold crept in, they told each other the legend, laughing nervously as shadows danced in the flickering firelight. It started as a faint rustling, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. One of the boys claimed it was just the wind, but they all fell silent, listening. Then they heard it, a slow, deliberate scratch like fingernails dragging against wood. They froze. The scratching grew louder, coming from every direction. Panic set in, and the firelight suddenly seemed too dim, too fragile against the darkness that pressed in around them. They grabbed their flashlights, pointing beams wildly into the trees, but saw nothing. The scratching stopped as quickly as it began. They laughed nervously, calling each other cowards. The noise, they decided, was just animals in the underbrush. A prank. They took their seats again, though their eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the fire. The hours passed, and they began to relax until one of the girls, Jen, noticed something glinting near the edge of the clearing, a faint shine, almost like a reflection. She thought it was a piece of glass, a discarded bottle maybe, catching the moonlight. She left the circle of fire to check. The others barely noticed, too deep in their chatter. Jen moved closer, and the object took shape in the darkness. It wasn't glass. It was a pair of eyes, wide and white, unblinking, staring at her from the ground. Before she could scream, something scuttled toward her, impossibly fast. A dark shape, dragging its body across the earth, limbs twisted and contorted, moving in jerking, unnatural motions. She stumbled back, tripping over a root, and the others finally noticed her cries. The flashlights snapped on, cutting through the darkness, but all they saw was Jen, pale and trembling, pointing at the shadows. Whatever had been there was gone. They pulled her back to the fire, but she wouldn't stop shaking. She kept muttering that she saw him, the Crawling Man. Her friends tried to calm her, blaming the dark, the stories, the alcohol, but no one could ignore the fear in her eyes. Then they heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it was louder and closer. Jen's eyes went wide, and she screamed that they needed to leave, that he was coming for them. The scratching turned into a furious scrabbling, like something clawing at the earth. The fire seemed to dim, the cold growing sharper and the darkness thicker. Someone grabbed Jen's arm, and they all bolted toward the trail. The light of their flashlights bounced wildly, catching glimpses of trees and undergrowth. They could hear the thing behind them now, a dragging, crawling noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was faster than them, too fast. One of the boys, Mike, was the first to trip. He went down hard, his flashlight flying into the darkness. The others barely stopped. They heard him scream, a choked, gurgling sound, and then there was silence. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. They ran harder, their breath coming in desperate gasps, the forest around them turning into a blur of shadow and branches. Jen's flashlight flickered and died, and she fell behind. Another scream echoed through the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged through the leaves. When they finally burst out of the woods, there were only two of them left, Jason and Emma. They stumbled onto the road, breathless and bleeding, too terrified to look back. The town's old clock tower began to chime midnight, and the air grew eerily still. The scratching had stopped. They made it to the sheriff's office, rambling about the Crawling Man, about the eyes in the dark and their missing friends. The sheriff, an old man with graying hair, looked at them with a mix of pity and resignation. He told them to go home, to forget the woods and to never speak of it again. He promised to search for the others, but they both knew he wouldn't find anything. He knew the stories, just like everyone else. The town didn't talk about what happened that night. Jason and Emma stopped speaking to each other, and neither stayed in town long after that Halloween. They moved far away, but the nightmares followed them. The scratching at the windows, the feeling of being watched, the eyes in the dark. Emma swore she saw him one night in her new apartment, crawling up the walls with that same jerking motion. Jason stopped answering his phone, and his apartment was found empty a month later, door wide open, the floor scratched with long, deep gouges. Years later, the woods are still there, untouched, avoided by locals who know better. Every Halloween, the wind carries a strange sound through the town, a faint, familiar scratching. They say that the crawling man waits for those who don't heed the warning, those foolish enough to look when they should keep their eyes closed, to listen when they should turn away. Some people still hear it on stormy nights, a soft scratching at the window, just faint enough to be mistaken for branches or the rustling of leaves. But the wise ones never look, because they know that if you do, if you catch sight of those wide, unblinking eyes staring back at you from the darkness, you might just see him smile, crawling ever closer. And once he finds you, he never leaves. There was a house at the end of Birchwood Lane that had been abandoned for decades. Everyone in the town knew it, and they knew to stay away. The windows were boarded up, the paint long since peeled away, and the roof sagged like it was too tired to stand. Some said it was cursed, others called it haunted. But every child in town had heard the same story, that if you walked past it after midnight, you'd hear a woman's voice, whispering your name. It was Halloween night when Ava and her friends decided to see for themselves if the rumors were true. They were young, bored, and brave in that reckless way teenagers often are. It was supposed to be a quick dare, a trip to the house, a knock on the door, and they'd run back, laughing about how silly they'd been. But when they arrived, the night was darker than they'd expected, and the cold seemed to bite deeper. Ava felt a chill as they stood in front of the rotting porch, staring at the crooked front door. The air was too still, and she swore she heard something faint, almost like someone breathing, but she shook it off. Her friends goaded her, and with a laugh that sounded more like a nervous gasp, she stepped up to the door and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed in the empty house, deep and hollow. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, then a soft thud, like footsteps, came from within. Her friends froze, their faces pale, but Ava laughed it off, telling them it was just the wind. She turned to leave, but that's when she heard it. A voice, soft and distant, whispering her name, "Ava?" She froze. Her friends asked what was wrong, but she couldn't speak. It felt like something had reached inside her chest and squeezed her heart. She swore it was just her imagination, a trick of the wind, but the sound of her name repeated, growing louder. And this time, her friends heard it too. Panic surged, and they ran, stumbling over each other, desperate to get away from the house. Ava felt eyes on her, something watching from the darkness, but she didn't dare look back. She kept running until she was safe inside her own home, locking the door behind her. She told herself it was over, that it was just a prank. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard the whisper again, faint and taunting, drifting through her open window. "Ava." She bolted upright, heart pounding. The curtains moved with a soft breeze, and she slammed the window shut, telling herself it was all in her head. But the whisper didn't stop. Days turned into weeks, and the voice followed her everywhere. It was always just out of sight, just behind her, like a shadow she couldn't escape. She stopped going to school, stopped talking to her friends who were starting to act strangely too. They'd stare at her with hollow eyes, mumbling about nightmares and shadows in the corners of their rooms. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and always called her name. Every night, she locked her windows and doors, but it didn't matter. It was like the voice knew where she was, whispering from the shadows, from the dark places in her home. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what she might hear, and the bags under her eyes grew deeper. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She decided to go back to the house, to face whatever was waiting there and make it stop. She had to know what it wanted. The town was deserted as she made her way down Birchwood Lane, the wind howling through the trees. The house loomed ahead, a black shape against the night sky, and the air seemed to buzz with a strange electric energy. She walked up to the porch, her heart hammering in her chest, and pushed open the door. It creaked, the sound cutting through the night like a scream. Inside, the house was empty and cold. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was heavy with the scent of mold and decay. The darkness was oppressive, pressing in on her like a living thing. She called out, her voice trembling, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no answer, just silence. Then she heard it again, her name whispered right next to her ear. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty space. The voice grew louder, echoing through the house, coming from the walls themselves. She covered her ears, screaming for it to stop, but the voice only grew more frantic, more desperate. Then she saw it, a figure at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the darkness. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with long black hair hanging in matted strands over her face. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She raised a bony finger, pointing at Ava. "Come here," the woman whispered, her voice like broken glass. Ava couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman's smile grew wider, and she started to descend the stairs, her feet not touching the ground. Ava turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. She was screaming, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The woman was getting closer, her whisper turning into a chant. "Ova, Ova, Ova!" Desperation took over, and Ava ran up the stairs, the boards creaking under her weight. She could hear the woman following, feel the cold breath on her neck. At the top of the stairs, she saw a door, slightly ajar, and she threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. The room was empty except for a single mirror hanging on the wall, its surface cracked and dirty. She backed away, pressing herself against the far wall, her eyes locked on the mirror. The whispers had stopped, and the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, the glass began to move, the reflection warping and shifting. She saw her own face, pale and terrified, staring back at her. But something was wrong. Her reflection smiled, a cold, twisted grin that didn't belong to her. The eyes in the mirror were black, empty voids, and the mouth moved, whispering her name. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head, but the reflection's grin widened. Suddenly it reached out, and a cold, bony hand burst through the glass, grabbing her wrist with an icy grip. She tried to pull away, but it was too strong, dragging her toward the mirror. She screamed, feeling the cold spread through her body, paralyzing her limbs. The darkness in the mirror seemed to swell, filling the room, swallowing her whole. When her parents found her the next morning, Ava was gone. The only sign she had ever been there was a single, bloody handprint on the mirror's cracked surface. Her friends never spoke of that night again, though they too started hearing the whispers, soft, distant, but unmistakably there. One by one, they left the town, trying to escape the voice that called them in the dead of night. But it didn't matter. The house at the end of Birchwood Lane still stands, waiting for the next foolish soul who dares to listen, who dares to call out to the darkness. And the whispers never stop. There was an old winding road on the outskirts of town known as Devil's Bend. It was a place few dared to travel after sunset, for the locals spoke of strange lights and whispers that filled the night. Some swore they'd seen ghostly figures darting between the trees, while others spoke of a deep, hollow sound like distant laughter. The most persistent legend, however, was of the night hag, a creature said to haunt the woods along the road, preying on those who lingered too long in the darkness. Ben had heard the stories, but he didn't believe them. He was new to town, renting an old house near the woods for the quiet and solitude. He liked the eerie atmosphere of the town, and the rumors of Devil's Bend felt like little more than silly superstitions. His friends warned him to stay away from the road after dark, but Ben laughed it off. He wasn't afraid of shadows. One night, as Halloween approached, Ben decided to take a walk down Devil's Bend. It was a foggy evening, the kind where the mist hung low and heavy, curling around the gnarled trees like a living thing. He brought a flashlight, its beam cutting through the thickening darkness, and began the slow walk along the twisting road. The air was cold and still, and there was no sound except the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he walked, the fog grew denser, muffling the world around him until it felt like he was the only person left in the world. He He paused for a moment, hearing a faint rustling in the underbrush, but dismissed it as an animal. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees pressing in closer, their bare branches like skeletal hands reaching out for him. A faint glow appeared in the distance, a soft, flickering light, like a lantern, swaying in the breeze. He followed it, curious, feeling a strange pull that he couldn't resist. The light seemed to retreat deeper into the woods, drawing him away from the safety of the road. He hesitated, the warnings echoing in his mind, but curiosity won out. He stepped off the path, the wet leaves sinking underfoot, and followed the glow through the twisting trees. It led him to a small clearing, where an old, crumbling well stood in the center, half buried under a blanket of moss. The light hung above it, wavering like a dying flame, casting long, distorted shadows. Ben stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the well. It was deeper than it looked, the bottom lost in shadows. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, rising up from the depths, barely more than a breath. His name. He recoiled, stumbling back, the light vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The woods were plunged into darkness, and he fumbled with his flashlight, the beam shaking in his trembling hands. The whisper grew louder, insistent, echoing in his ears. Ben? He backed away, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He turned to leave the clearing, but the path was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in, and he started to run, branches clawing at his clothes and face, the whisper following him like a shadow. No matter how fast he ran, the sound was always there, soft, cruel, mocking. He broke through the trees, stumbling back onto the road, gasping for breath. But the whisper didn't stop. It was louder now, and he realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind him. He turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in his hand, and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the pale moonlight. A woman with long, tangled hair and a face hidden in shadow. Her eyes were black holes, empty and bottomless, and her mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile. Ben's flashlight flickered, casting the figure in and out of shadow, and he felt his legs lock in terror. The woman took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze never leaving his. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He took a stumbling step backward, then another, and then he ran. He didn't remember the sprint home. All he knew was the pounding of his heart and the cold, empty eyes that seemed to follow him through the darkness. He slammed the door behind him, locking it tight, and turned on every light in the house, trembling with fear. He tried to tell himself it wasn't real, that he'd imagined it, but the whisper still echoed in his ears, growing fainter and fainter until it vanished altogether. For days, he stayed inside, refusing to answer calls, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. But the nightmares came every night. Dreams of the woods, of the whisper, of the woman with her empty eyes and that terrible, too-wide smile. Each night the dream ended the same way, with her standing at the foot of his bed, her cold breath on his face, whispering his name. One night, unable to take the isolation any longer, he decided to leave the house and go to the local bar. Maybe a drink would calm his nerves, help him forget. As he pulled open the front door, he froze. A single muddy footprint was on the threshold, leading from the woods straight to his door. He didn't go to the bar. He packed his things that night, threw them in his car, and left town, not daring to look back. He drove through the night, exhaustion gripping him, but the sense of relief was fleeting. As dawn broke, he pulled over at a rest stop to catch his breath. The world was waking up, sunlight breaking through the trees, and he felt safe for the first time in days. But then he heard it, a soft, distant whisper carried on the morning breeze. His name, clear and unmistakable. Heart pounding, he jumped into his car and drove until the sun set again, not caring where he ended up, only that he was far, far away. Weeks passed, and he started to believe he had escaped. The whispers stopped, the nightmares faded, and he found a new place to live in a small city far from the cursed woods. But something had changed. He felt eyes on him at the oddest times, a sense of being watched that he couldn't shake. Every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow that darted away when he turned. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard the familiar creak of his front door opening. His blood ran cold, and he squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. Soft footsteps moved through the house, growing louder as they approached his bedroom. The door opened with a soft creak, and he felt the presence standing over him so close he could feel the chill in the air. Then he heard it. A soft, almost affectionate whisper right next to his ear. Ben, I found you. He didn't dare open his eyes, didn't dare breathe. The cold grew sharper, the air heavy with the scent of decay. He waited, each second stretching into an eternity, until the room finally went quiet. The air warmed, and he was alone. But he knew it wasn't over. He knew she was still there, waiting for him to open his eyes, to acknowledge her, to see that smile and those empty eyes staring back at him from the darkness. And so, every night, Ben lay in bed, his eyes shut tight, waiting for the whisper that he knew would never really leave. Because once you've seen her, the night hag never lets you go.